Om Gangadipataye Namaha. Namaste. So we've been going back and forth here in the last few verses between the world as seen as real, existing independently in and of itself, versus seeing the world as either a false appearance or as completely non-existent whatsoever. The first of these views or philosophical conclusions, siddhanta or vada teachings, is known as the Vivartavada. Vivartavada means we see the world, but we have information from higher sources, Vedas, that this world is actually unreal. It's an appearance, like a mirage. We've talked about this quite a bit. So if it's really just a mirage, does it really exist at all? No. And that's the Ajatavada, the Siddhanta, the conclusion that the world actually doesn't exist at all. And the individual self and even consciousness is simply a byproduct of illusion, ignorance, and a wrong view. So the realized beings, they don't know this or think this. They realize it and they become it. Their life every day is non-different from what you read in these books about non-dual, absolute consciousness. So what does it take to get there? Well, there has to be a bridge from the ordinary world of illusion to the real world of Brahman. And one of the things about this book that makes it so important is that it is such a bridge. More or less every other verse is going back and forth, isn't it? Between Vivartavada and Ajatavada. So this particular verse is in the Ajatavada. But the previous verse was in Vivartavada. And so we're getting a view of both worlds, we're getting both views of the world from these two philosophical viewpoints. And these are helpful to guide us toward the experience of those viewpoints. Now let's look at the verse. Is the word real befitting to this world, which is seen only by the illusory and changeful mind, but not by self, the source of mind? So, is it real or is it not? I asked for comments, and people have been making comments and questions, and that's really great. That's really nice, okay? So, let's take it up a step, okay? Let's have the comments and discussion be actually about the topic. And the topic in this whole section is the reality of the world. So here he's saying that the world, as a real thing, is seen only by the mind, not by the self. The self also sees the world, but sees it as an appearance only, as an illusion. So, it doesn't take it serious. How can we? Because everything is changing all the time, and you never know what's going to happen tomorrow. So why make a big bet on certain expectations coming true when, who knows, really, How many times, come on, be honest with yourself. How many times has your mind been wrong? How many times has your thinking been completely inaccurate? How many times have you been blindsided by somebody you thought you knew, coming up with something totally unexpected, and so forth, and so on, etc., etc. It happens every day. You have this big mind and intelligence thing, this ego structure and all this stuff, these thoughts. And ostensibly the whole purpose of it is to predict the future and increase our chances of survival, right? But how often do we successfully predict the future? And how often do we just worry about it for no good reason and to no good effect? Be honest with yourself. The mind is always making mistakes because it doesn't know the truth. The source of the mind is the truth. And the mind cannot look at its own source. It can only reflect it back on itself. And this is meditation. We did a whole series on Secret of the Golden Flower, and the motto of that series is, turn the light around. Okay? We talked about how consciousness is illuminating the world, and that's how we perceive things. If it wasn't for our consciousness, as far as we're concerned, they don't exist. So, consciousness illuminates the world, and the mind is ordinarily focused outside, externally. So we're saying turn it around, and instead of putting that light out into the world where it just gets lost, really, turn it back on itself and examine your own self. The self-luminous nature of self, and consciousness of consciousness, awareness of awareness, even better. There's a state prior to consciousness where one knows that one exists and that one is aware. And of course, that implies one is also capable of consciousness. But this is before consciousness actually develops. Consciousness is duality. And we're talking about non-duality. And that means we're not keeping score. We're not saying there's a 0 or 1, or we're not using any number at all. We're just saying it's not 2. It's non-dual. So if it's non-dual, then there's no division into subject and object. But at the same time, it's not unconsciousness. It's not ignorance. It's not sleep. In fact, it's a full awareness, 360 degrees. So that's only possible if we have the raw awareness before it becomes conditioned by differences, such as me and not me, internal, external, and so on, before it becomes dual. So when the awareness knows that it exists and that it is capable of consciousness, but it has no object, the only thing it has to be aware of is itself. And you can't really say that the self can ever become an object of itself. That doesn't make sense. Then there would be two selves. I mean, I know some people believe that, higher self, lower self, and all that kind of nonsense. But how can one be a self, which means an integrated being, and that has two parts or something? I don't understand it. It doesn't work for me. I experience myself as whole and complete, unitary, with a tendency to fragment at the edges and identify with this or that object. But if that tendency is kept in check by awareness and meditation, spiritual discipline, in other words, if we do our sadhana and then methodically remove all of these identifications, the consciousness becomes whole and full and complete. That's the good stuff. That's what we do all that work, all that sitting for. Not just to review our childhood emotional traumas, like that poor guy from New York, but to actually remove all the thoughts from the mind. And the best approach to that is removing desire. Desire has two forms: desire for something and desire against something. I want this and I don't want that. It's also called lust and hatred in some traditions. So this lust and hatred, positive and negative attachment, desire, then creates something called a papancha, which is a waterfall, a cascade, like a rapids, in the mountains, of thoughts related to the root thought. Now, of course, the original papancha is I, the ego. Not I, the self, but I, the ego, the false self, the projection of self, the shadow of the real self. It's a shadow because it's only negative, it's only mind stuff, and it just obscures the light, gets in the way. So when we remove this shadow and the light comes through, even though it's reflected light coming from the purified mind, the mind devoid of desire, the ocean on a calm night, devoid of waves, and reflecting the moon in the sky. That's such a beautiful image. But that's what it's like. There's no desires, means there's no agitation, no waves, and everything is reflected purely and clearly as it is, including oneself. So in that state, there's no hankering or lamentation, no desire or fear. And everything is seen as oneself. Everything is seen as dear. You know that wonderful passage in the Shvetashvatara Upanishad that the wife or husband is not dear because of the wife or husband. They're dear because of the self, because they are an expression of or manifestation of the self. Similarly, the children are not dear because of themselves. They're dear because of the self, because the self is dear. And possessions and homes and cattle and everything, that we attach ourselves to, relatives and so on and so forth, the country, and even the world itself is not dear because of itself, but because of their relationship with the self. The self is our self. As soon as we get that, we're not looking for something out there. When we say we're searching for the self or the authentic being or whatever, or meditating on consciousness or whatever, we're not searching for something out there, even if we are watching the light. It's only because we're turning our attention inward towards ourselves. We are searching for the one who is searching. We are looking for the one who is looking. We are trying to become the one who already is. Honestly, you have to laugh, So, okay, somebody's got to have a question about this. This is like so fundamental. And all the conditioning we've been told our whole lives is that the world is objective and you're an individual and you have this identity and so on and so forth and like this, okay? So, come on. There's got to be some doubts around this. These madmen saying that the world is not real and all this stuff. Let's hear about it. Om Tat Sat. Om Harihi Om.